Hello, and welcome to Women in Comics, Intersectional Feminism in a Globalized Context, hosted by the Futuro Cultural Festival. Our panelists today are Ashley A. Woods, Bishak Som, Connie Michelle Molina, and Wendy Xu. For those who don't know me, I'm Camilla Zhang, a comics and prose writer and former comics outreach lead for the international crowdfunding platform Kickstarter. Some of my work has been published by Top Cow and Kickstarted projects like Reading with Pictures and Crossed Genres. My publishing background includes Marvel, Mad Cave, and DC Comics, where I served as assistant editor on the entire Before Watchmen series, Batman Black and White Volume 4, Batman Death by Design, and Batman Noel. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers and then go into some key terms we'll discuss during the panel. Ashley A. Woods is a comic book artist, writer, and creator from Chicago, known for her work on the Niobe, Lady Castle, and Tomb Raider series. She got her start through self-publishing her action fantasy comic series, Millennia War, which led to her career in comics and TV. Her most prominent work is Niobe, She Is Life, with actress Amandla Stenberg and Sebastian A. Jones of Stranger Comics. Her latest artwork can be seen with Marvel, Image Comics, and Vault Comics. Ashley is working with Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Yusef Komunyakaa, a new comic book series called Jupiter Invincible. Bishak Som, author of the graphic novels Aspara Engine from the Feminist Press, and Spellbound, a graphic memoir from Street Noise Books, grew up in New York City with parents who were originally from India. She received a master's degree in architecture from Harvard University and worked for many years in that field, most notably at I.M. Pei's New York office. Bishak's work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Boston Review, BuzzFeed, and The Huffington Post. Bishak lives in Brooklyn, New York. And here's some more cover images by her graphic memoir Spellbound, and also the cover that she did for We're Still Here, an all trans comics anthology. Connie Michelle Molina, AKA Melon Connie, is a visual media and plastic artist, biologist, and scientific illustrator who graduated from Universidad de los Andes, Bogota, Colombia, where she is from. In 2018, she won the BOTA contest for Universitary Art by the side of her all-women art collective, Severas Nenas, to produce and show the ceramic piece, Que Cerámica Tan Puca. She has been part of feminist collectives, La Mera Víbora, and Es Más Grave Que Eso, advocating for representation, inclusion, tolerance for women of all origins in the universitary art and theater scene in Bogota. She created and illustrated the female superhero based on Natalia Ponce de Leon, Colombian activist and burn victim, for Priyas Shakti in 2020. She directed, produced, and animated the intersectional feminist music video Los Chicos Si Lloran for the international rock band Diamante Eléctrico. Wendy Xu is a Brooklyn-based illustrator and comics artist with 3 upcoming graphic novels from HarperCollins. She is the co-creator of Mooncakes, a young adult fantasy graphic novel, published in 2019 from Lionforge Comics, and part of it can be read on mooncakescomic.tumblr.com. Her work has been featured on Catapult, Barnes & Noble Sci-Fi Fantasy Blog, and Tor.com, among other places. You can find more of her art on Instagram at Art of Wendy Xu or on Twitter at Angry Girl Comics. Now, before we get into the meat of the panel, the discussion, I wanted to contextualize the topics that we'll be discussing in a more globalized context. So in order to kind of understand how the world still operates under patriarchal systems and culture, we need to take a look at, race, colorism, sexual and gender identity, and the lasting effects of colonialism. So I want to introduce us to a term that is kind of the progeny, or for lack of a better word, the child of colonialism, which is globalization. So in a general sense, it is the increasing worldwide integration of economic, cultural, political, religious, and social systems, or sometimes it is also known as the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. And what people don't really understand, or maybe sometimes people don't realize, is that globalization is rooted in colonialism, which, was popularized in the 18th century, when Western Europe was going out and establishing colonies in the Americas. But now we kind of know it more as, in a general sense, as the policy of a country seeking to extend or retain its authority over other people or territories, generally with the aim of economic dominance. In the process of colonization, colonizers may impose their religion, language, economics, and other cultural practices on indigenous peoples. The foreign administrators rule the territory in pursuit of their interests, seeking to benefit from the colonized region's people and resources. Sorry, not 18th century, sorry. Fives and eights look very similar to me in my brain. So it's the 15th century that was part of the colonial era that is what is more popularly known in kind of international culture. So it's, again, predominantly associated with the European colonial period. And then we want to kind of understand diaspora, which is, a byproduct of colonialism and globalization. So diaspora is a scattered population whose origin lies in a separate geographic locale. Historically, the word diaspora was used to refer to the involuntary mass dispersion of a population from its indigenous territories, in particular the dispersion of Jews. This has since changed, and today there is no set definition of the term because its modern meaning has evolved over time, which actually is true of most language. And finally, we want to understand intersectionality, which is the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, and gender, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. That's pulled from the Oxford English Dictionary. The previous terms were pulled from Wikipedia. So thanks for bearing with all of these terminologies. I really think it's important for us all to kind of make sure that we're approaching from common basis of knowledge, because, most of us are in America right now, but I believe we can safely say that we all kind of understand our identities within the context of intersectionality and globalization and post-colonialism, right? So I want to start off the discussion with my first question, which is kind of centered around American writer, feminist, and activist Audre Lorde, who once said, "My sexuality is part and parcel of who I am, and my poetry comes from the intersection of me and my world." Let's start with the shock. Do you share the sentiment? If no, why not? If yes, how does it manifest in your own creative practice?
If anything, as a sort of substitute term for that, I guess it's my gender and my gender identity that lends some power or gives a certain heft to my work. But I will agree, the intersection between myself and the world, I guess, is where I draw a lot of the inspiration and the execution of my work. But, I'm not sure how much I can say that is the case in in some of my work, which is more sort of fantastical, I guess. And it's maybe operating not in the intersection between me and the world, but in some other liminal space. Um, and I think that's a more internal landscape that I'm drawing from, maybe. Certainly there are elements of that, it's not a vacuum inside here. So it's like a lot of the inspiration that is drawn from the world, but I think it's not necessarily it's somehow filtered, and I'm not sure how much of it has to do with how I interact with the world, but rather like how I process certain elements from it. But on the whole, I would say that, yeah, that I would think that statement was true for a lot of artists. I mean, we operate as individuals in the world and we navigate through the world. And that's where a lot of your source material, where your raw material comes from. So yeah, I think that makes up a lot of the sort of stuff of my comics work.
Like there's lots of, the more I read just like widely and get into different kinds of media, the more I realize that there are certain things that I feel like would benefit from just saying this is a universal human experience. I think the othering of being told, well, this is an immigrant experience, this is a this is specifically a Chinese experience, this is whatever. I think we could just all benefit to take a step back and say, yes, this is an immigrant experience, but this is also not uniquely an immigrant experience. And I think a lot of times in wanting to specify that something is an immigrant experience, we risk I don't want to say, like, I'm not trying to say we make it more palatable to a white audience. That's absolutely not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that I wish mainstream audiences would broaden their minds, and instead of saying instead of viewing or labeling things as this is an immigrant story, this is a story about Asian women, instead say this is a universal story. I've been watching a lot of The Crown on Netflix, which is, crazy, insane British royal drama, but I am struck by how a lot of the themes seem to resonate with things that my mom loves. And I have this joke that like a lot of Asian moms love Princess Diana, like they're obsessed with Princess Diana. And I feel like watching The Crown, I have a newfound appreciation or a newfound understanding of my own cultural upbringing, even though these people are so far removed from who I am, racially, financially, like all of it, because the aspects of these like insane, arbitrary, made up cultural rules that they've imposed on themselves and their families, and this like insistence on maintaining tradition, like a lot of these themes are themes that resonate with me, and actually has led to an understanding of how my own family works, not just as an Asian family, but just as someone who had this very specific family dynamic. So I think if we were to flip it and tell people that instead of The Crown being like a standard, like a universal human story, which it absolutely is not. These are the most wealthy, privileged people on the planet. But like they're trying to bill it as a universal human story, and I'm sitting there like, this is so not a universal human story. But instead of trying to like show that The Crown is a universal human story, why aren't we doing the same thing with like immigrant stories or with other stories by marginalized communities? And if we were to flip this narrative and say you should read these not just because you're getting a different experience, but because it is a human story, like maybe you'll find something that resonates with you, I think that would be so much more helpful and like kind, instead of drawing these kind of arbitrary distinctions, because identity, there's a writer that I've been reading a lot of science writing, and one of the science writers I read, Merlin Sheldrake, he says identity is a question instead of an answer set in stone, of, you know, the things that he studies, and I think that is a very good way to look at something. um, and like if we think of identity as a question, I think that makes us a lot more open to, not just exploring other people's experiences and accepting them without putting our own judgment on them, but also kind of questioning ourselves and the stories that we make. And I think, yeah, those are kind of rules that I've been trying to live by. But you know, it is a question instead of an answer. So those are always it's always something I'm looking for. I'm always exploring.
I think it's definitely true that artists work as lenses through the world, like they take their own contexts and translate them into their own art and to the world to see how they see the world. I personally have a lot of context, self portraits, and stuff like that because my art works like the connection between the us, the we, and the me. Definitely is super biased by my way of seeing the world, and it's a very specific way as a non-binary Latino. And well, it's important to get all these differences between the artists that maybe they come from the same context, but we all have a different way of seeing life. And it's definitely just like as specific as white men's context. We can have much of that, but the pretty things lay to in the specifications and the little special things about each one of us that's very diverse, I think. Maybe yes, my sexuality doesn't determine my art specifically, and maybe not neither my gender, but definitely my context, my life in Bogota every day, and my just the way I see the world, my friends and my family, the people I love, determine the topics I'm taking into my art every day. And yeah.
Thank you. Ashley, what about you?
In some ways, I can relate to those sentiments, and in other ways, I can't relate to it. In the ways that I relate to it is more so uh, illustrated in the way that the world relates to me as a Black female. In the way that I don't relate to it is because I don't relate to the world based on what my gender and race is. What inspires my art personally is just anything that brings joy to me, whether it's entertainment or people or just different experiences. But I never walk through the world, even now that I have a better understanding and greater clarity, you know, that sometimes comes with age and experience. Even now, knowing what I know, I still don't relate to the world primarily as a Black female. I just relate to it as a person. You know, maybe that's like how some people describe as humanism. I'm not well versed in that topic, but in any case, there was a time before my career kicked off a few years ago where I actually went against the grain, and I didn't want to be labeled or boxed in based on what I am. And I noticed that a lot of my initial projects were based on the fact that I'm a Black female. And it offended me at first. But at the same time, as you had mentioned not too long ago, Camilla, you said something along the lines as sometimes a person can bear certain responsibilities based on what check boxes they hit. And so I definitely had those experiences. But yes, I don't relate to it personally, but I see how the world would relate to me based on what they see.
100%, 100%. Sorry, my cat just decided to jump on me, even though I was like, no. But yeah, like it's basically what I was trying to say earlier was that like it's both it's a burden because it's an expectation sometimes that other people see on us, but it is also sometimes an inescapable lens because it is how you see the world is very impacted by also how the world treats you, right? And so it's kind of like the symbiotic, for lack of a better term, relationship with you and the world and what you put out there. And it's on the one hand kind of a yoke in some ways, you know, that we all, maybe not we all, but like I personally, from what I'm understanding from you all, is that it seems like you long to escape it, and yet it is still very much like, I don't know, it's complicated, isn't it?
How much one almost aspires to be, as you were saying, like as clueless as like not being aware of your identity, to the point where, I'll give you an example, you know, when I write a story, my default characters are usually South Asian women, right? But I don't really think too much about that. It's just like a default setting. So I wonder, like, and now, you know, more and more, they're like trans women of South Asian origin. So that's the way I start off. That's like my baseline. And I wonder how much like of that is me being unaware of it. You know, it's like almost like, oh yeah, of course I'm going to write this character and then it's going to be a South Asian trans woman, you know? And I think there's a level of like obliviousness that goes into that that's almost aspirational, for a lack of a better way to put it. So it's interesting because, yeah, I mean, a certain amount, almost all of that comes from my identity, but also there's a level at which that plays out unconsciously.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to my second question. Sorry, I'm like getting a little bit in the weeds here, but so my second question kind of starts with as a statement. Unfortunately, even with so many educational materials out there, there are still too many people around the world who do not understand how problems manifest for women and women of color. If you feel comfortable sharing, what obstacles have you faced as a woman of color in comics? And what advice would you give budding creators, and what message would you like to give our allies?
Ooh.
You want to go backwards and let's start with Ashley?
Camilla. Yeah, I've had some experiences, but yikes. I really haven't had any pushback from the most pushback that I've had was from people who look like me. And there's this thing called the Highlander complex, you know, tokenism. So right before I had my very first project, a few people in the industry, other artists, caught wind of what I was working on. And I tend to operate very low key. And so certain people in the industry, you know, it's very cutthroat and people will dig when they want to know something. So once they learned about this opportunity, I had a lot of pushback, and it was a hard lesson, but it was necessary. It taught me, it was a growth spurt. Maybe I've been lucky enough to debut in this particular era where everyone is a lot more cognizant of each other. So I haven't had any racism per se hold me back. I haven't experienced any glass ceiling situations. But in any case, I've experienced just a lot of ego within people who look like me. And that's why I personally have an issue with identity politics, meaning oh, just because we look the same or we are the same gender, we're all automatically on the same team. And that's just, life isn't black and white like that. Life has a lot of nuances and gray tones. So I think it's better to take people as they come as individuals. Because I've actually had a lot of white people help me out as well. And as a quote unquote Black person, that would be going against code to verbalize everything that I just said. But at the same time, that's my experience. So that's why I was kind of like, yikes, like, how do I answer that? I mean, there's really only one answer, which is, the truth. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, my friend Jamila, we were in a panel together at one point in New York Comic Con a couple of years ago. And she was talking about, like, basically the saying was, skin folk ain't always kinfolk.
Right.
And yeah, I've also had experiences with other women of color where it has been, it's not so much like they say that, like, oh, you're betraying the race, or that they don't say anything. Sometimes it becomes personal. And so, like, but you don't expect kind of like infighting. Well, maybe you do. You hear about infighting all the time, right? Like in any kind of group. The Democrats, maybe not so much the Republicans. But...
Or like even not to cut you off, like even when you go to Africa, some people say, oh, we want racism or whatever, all the isms to disappear. Well, we still have, tribalism. If everyone looked the same, like there will be like some type of division, no matter what has been eliminated from society. Maybe that sounds pessimistic, but
it's true. Like they always find differences to segregate people from others, even if they are literally the same. It's happening a lot here in Colombia with the Venezuela situation, with all the immigrants from Venezuela, because Maduro it's making a really bad administration. So the Colombians came super xenophobic about people that are literally the same as us. And there is a lot of racism, a lot of xenophobia here in Colombia, and we're literally all colored people,
Yeah, I think that the human spirit can rise above tribalism. It's a challenge, right? We have to like really work hard to do that. But I have hope. I have hope. So Connie, how about you? Like, do you feel have you ever experienced any kind of obstacles as a woman of color in comics, especially if you have tried to get work, international work? Like, are there any kinds of barriers as for you as like just in your experience? Have there been any barriers, I suppose?
Well, I'm pretty new in the industry. Like I just started like months ago. So it hasn't happened a lot to me, but in my group of illustrator and comic artist friends, I have experienced some of sexism, mostly being like condescension, in a way of condescension, like, oh, you still draw superheroes? Who is drawing superheroes in these years? Like, oh, you're so cute. Oh, oh, so girly. You talk about love. Oh, how girly. It's just mostly like that. And they're like, it's not even like segregated or distanced people from me. They're like friends that still just do this kind of criticism based on who I am. And it's also like bringing a bit of the topic we were talking before, that everybody's expecting, if you are like Latin American or Black or non-binary or a minority, you have to be an activist, because if you're not, you're not doing it okay. And it's just so frustrating, because I am just a person just living the life and talking about the things I see around. And maybe I don't want to fight, but I have to. And maybe, of course, I have a lot of privilege here in Colombia because I am lighter Latino, and my parents are, well, they're well positioned socially. So I had access to art school. Like nobody studies art here in Colombia because it's just a privilege. And inside that, like a cloud of privilege, the artists have to be plastic artists, like painters, sculptors, gallerists. But a comic artist, what are you gonna do with your life? So that's mostly the problems I have faced here.
And in terms of like advice you would give young creators, such as like if you were to give young Connie advice, or if you were to give, you know, somebody who's your friend who wants to do better in the world, who wants to be an ally in the world, what kind of advice would you give these two sets of people?
For the first one, for the young creators, I would say work first on yourself. Get better. Come on, get rid of your stigmas, get some mental health, some power, some self-love, and then put it in your art. Trust what you're doing, trust your processes, be gentle, and respect your own things and your own processes. What you're doing is valid and it's important. And for the allies, I have a word that's mostly don't take the word for the people that are in front. Give support and fight, but do not take the word for the people that are really on trouble or being segregated. Mm-hmm. And support your local artists, buy things, we eat too.
Thank you. How about Bashak? Like, what are the obstacles that you face, if you feel comfortable sharing, and what advice would you give young Bashak and any like people who claim to be or want to be allies?
A lot of the comics that I was seeing at comic conventions and stuff, the kind of gangs of people that I would see at these conventions, it always seemed like a white boys club, you know, and that really kind of put me off because that obviously it's not the kind of work I was doing. I made my own stuff anyway, but I thought maybe, you know, I don't know if there's room for me in this kind of comics world or not. I couldn't tell. Even like into the like mid of like 2015 or 2016 or so, when I was starting work on Apsara Engine, my first graphic novel, I was still sort of aiming for places that to some degree were responsible for that kind of white boys club, like, you know, Fantagraphics and Quarterly. And I thought those were the kinds of places to look to get some validation and to be put out into the world, to get my work put out into the world. And I didn't really find any takers there, but, you know, thank goodness places like, you know, publishers like the Feminist Press and Street Noise Books find homes for people like me, you know, and for femmes, for women of color. And these are presses that want to amplify voices like ours. So I guess what I would say is like, just, you know, if you're a young creator or you're a woman of color, I would say find your tribe. And I'm sorry to bring tribes back into this because we know we're talking about tribalism, but what I mean by tribe is community, you know? So like if you're a young trans woman of color who creates comics, find other people, find other trans folks who do the same thing. And I did that, and that was a great lifeline for me, doing the trans anthology. I met so many people who operate in the same sort of landscapes that I did, and that was a great source of strength for me. So if you find more people like yourself and you're able to create a posse, you know, and that posse can sort of like expand, and as these things do, there's a great strength to be found in that, you know, and you can, I think you can fight back and create your own communities and, you know, stake out your own territory. And I think that's really important.
My third question is, the comics industry is truly an international one, yet so many are focused on either the American or Japanese market. Can each of you talk about what working within your own country has been like and how it has differed from working with publishers and organizations outside of your country?
Well, I feel like the American market has definitely taken on a more political tone, especially since 2015. I feel like the pendulum has swung as far in one direction as it could, and now it's slowly swinging back. I feel like the American audience, in particular, the silent audience, majority of people, they are frustrated with the current climate of American comics, which is why you're seeing this resurgence of anime and manga. And I think that creators inserting their own personal stories and personalities into their characters is encouraged, but I think what sets anime and manga apart and why audiences are now flocking to that medium is because of how it's done. Anime and manga tend to take a more like fantastical approach to their stories. Even with I'm thinking about the origin story of like Goku and Dragon Ball Z, which is very similar to Superman. You know, they both come from a planet that has been destroyed and like their people have been wiped out. But at the same time, Goku, he's a very simple character because he just emphasizes never giving up and just plowing through with sheer willpower and strength of heart and soul to achieve something. Whereas with Superman, I feel like maybe he has become limited in some ways because he's a little bit all over the place. Like sometimes he's dark, sometimes he's, you know, just all about a lot of people will refer to him as a Boy Scout, you know, just very goody. But that's how I see it right now. That's what I see is happening in the industry. Just American audiences are wanting something a little bit different right now. I think audiences are also burnt out with the political state, especially with the election being tomorrow. People just really want to check out and have a good time. Even if it's not the attention of the American media, American comic industry, a lot of audiences feel like they're being preached to and they don't want that. They really want to relate to their entertainment, like much of like the 80s and 90s. You know, you just open up a good book or you watch a good movie and you just check out. And that's the thing. A lot of people just want to mentally check out, especially with how COVID affected everyone's finances. Everyone is just really, really stressed out. And the last thing that they want to see is, you know, Law and Order, you know, how it's like ripped from the headlines. They don't want to see ripped from the headlines in their comics. They just want to see, you know, someone like blast through a wall with a photon beam or, you know, what have you. It's just something over the top. Escapism is the highest priority right now.
And I know I totally get what Ashley was saying about like wanting to have people be individuals and not have them have to be representing something else other than their own humanity all the time. But I was, you know, for me, it's a question of like actively having more people who look like me on the page. And I think, again, that's like a default setting for me. So whether that's like, you know, something that comes out of a internationalist or global mindset, I don't know, but there's a strange tension between the tribalism of like having all these South Asian characters as my sort of stock characters, and the sort of tendency to want to expand one's horizons to embrace, all cultures and all identities. It's just that I'm at this point in my life, I think, working quite locally within my own head is the way I feel most comfortable.
How about you, Connie?
Well, here in Colombia, there's a very small or maybe even non-existent market for comics. People just see it in their everyday life, like the things that get in the Sunday newspaper, and they're for kids. Meanwhile, I just prepare breakfast. And so even there, it's specifically for boys that can consume comics here and for little boys, maybe. So even the people that go regularly to the Comic Con here in Colombia or things like that don't buy the things that artists display there. I think it's related to the situation in Colombia. Like, we just ended the wars with guerrilla, we just passed the 80s drug thing. So everybody's still in survival mode. So everything that is not getting some bread to eat and getting some good sleep and working, it's not relevant. So art is never relevant here in Colombia. It's just segregated for people with privilege, and people with privilege consume fine arts. So going to see the opera or maybe going to galleries and buying old paintings sometimes. But comics, what is that like? And me, in my own experience, I like when I was small, I made tiny collections of the newspaper comics I saw. Here in Latin America, we have Mafalda, made by Kino, and I love Mafalda. I have books about her. And then in my teenagers, I just discovered with the internet that comics were not just that. They talked about like bad things or political issues, and I discovered my favorite singular did comics, Gerard Way from My Chemical Romance, and I was just so hyped. And I started buying comics, reading Batman and stuff, and I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm so alternative. I am like a boy. My first boyfriends lent me comics because they were huge nerds about Batman, and I just entered to this world like blindfolded. I never knew what was I gonna get out there, and a very few little time ago I discovered there's even more than that. There's like gender issues, there's minorities, there's just like this tiny like sensitive art in comics that's talking about the daily life of people or they situationships and things. And I just discovered this not long ago, and I'm super hyped about it because this is what I've been doing for a while now in my sketchbooks and in my world, in my art, and it's happening all around the world. So it's just like feeling connected with people I never knew I could have a connection with. And definitely, yeah, there's no market here. I have to get out of here to to just sell things because no, it's not gonna happen here.
Wendy, how about you?
Well, like Bishak, I've never actually experienced like being published outside the US because I have a background in essentially American publishing. I worked at a children's catalog for 5 years, and so through that, I learned so much about the American publishing market that I know that American publishing does like a foreign book fair where they try to sell foreign rights and stuff. And I know that my book Mooncakes has sold like a Spanish edition in Spain. But that's the extent of experience that I've had working with a foreign market. But I did grow up basically on manga and on Chinese comics. Such as there was this one Chinese comic that was like called, translated to like The Adventures of Three Hair. It was about a kid who was bald and had three hairs, and he was a little orphan. And it was actually really quite sad, but they were kind of 4-panel gag strips of his life during World War II and the aftermath of that. And it was drawn by an artist who had lived through all of this. So it was kind of an interesting, not just a history lesson, but also kind of this really, really trying to find like levity in the worst moments of life when you're living, when you are basically a child who is living on the street, like the kind of levity you could find in those experiences that really spoke to me. And yeah, those are, and I continue to read a lot of manga, and I do love translated editions of French comics, like especially the recent ones. There's a lot of artists working predominantly in the French market, like Locke Locatelli, whose work I really admire and love. So I don't read as many webcomics as I used to as a teenager, but I think my experience is like I have, certain aesthetic tastes, and if I see something I like, I'll just kind of gravitate towards that and try to figure out, I think for me, the way that something is drawn and the story that it tells comes first, and then the author's identity comes second. Like it's a tricky thing when it's really interesting. Like it's so interesting being on these panels and being asked like kind of what your influences are, because a lot of the time I almost feel like fraudulent saying that my influences are mostly like from British fantasy storytellers that I read growing up as a kid. I read a lot of like Diana Wynne Jones and Iva Ibbotson, and just a lot of like these kind of old British fantasists that are not kind of in line with, what are your influences as a diverse creator or whatever. But it is what it is. And it was always the stories that drew me first, and how I kind of extrapolated from them and put them, fit them into my own life.
Maybe we can go through like influences, like because Wendy, you were talking about how you're mainly influenced by British fantasy illustrators, and like how you work that into your own stories, and like maybe talk about, like, we can even go into the tools you use, if you would like to talk about like brushes and things like that.
I mean, I can keep, if that's okay with everyone, I can extrapolate on my influences, if you guys don't mind me going first. Okay. For writing, I am mostly influenced by British fantasy authors, and especially like I think Howl's Moving Castle was such a formative book for me growing up. This idea of like you can have a cozy domestic fantasy world, but I think that is interesting because I love it. It's so interesting because a lot of that actually crosses over, like this interest in British fantasy crosses over into like my visual influence of Studio Ghibli, because they do a lot of adaptations of like British fantasy works. So I do think that there is like this strange cross-cultural influence. But like visually, I'm also very inspired by just going outside and looking at the natural world, especially recently when kind of being in lockdown has forced me to, instead of like being able to travel, I'm like, well, I guess I'll just like look through a microscope. I bought this like tiny microscope, this like little paper microscope kit. Actually, it's called not to no advertising here. This is not an advertisement, but it's called a Foldscope, and it's a tiny paper microscope. And you can look at things through a different, it's just very interesting to look at something through a different perspective, whether it's through a microscope, whether it's like reading a book that's giving you a perspective of the author, or, again, watching The Crown. I'm sorry, I've been so obsessed with like binging The Crown because it's just so strangely exotic and fascinating, but also like at the same time I can see how a lot of, this relates to a lot of like my family. But I think that as far as artistic influences go, I try to never shut down like potential sources of inspiration. And I do think that it's like there's so much stuff. Sorry, I'm like all over the place, but there's so much stuff that you can look at under a microscope that would make a cool sci-fi or fantasy creation, or you can kind of world build off of that. I love also playing video games, and Hollow Knight has been one of my favorite video games, which is about like a tiny little bug knight fighting his way through an underground world, but it's or their way. The bug is not specified gender, but the idea of a small thing being kind of larger than life and larger than what it is, or what the viewpoint could look like from the perspective of such a small thing, has always fascinated me. I love dollhouses. I love the borrowers, and making like tiny things accessible to the like another audience, perhaps. I got, again, really into reading about nature during this whole thing, so I got to do an interview with the author of Entangled Life, which is a book about fungi, Merlin Sheldrake. And I think thinking about looking at things and using metaphors to explore what some kind of scientific concepts would be like to an audience that is maybe not as well versed in science. That's also very interesting to me. But learning how to see things differently, I feel like, has been the theme of my life this year. Whether it's looking through a microscope or contemplating like a different type of story, those are all things that I've been kind of thinking about this year.
I guess for you, sure, go ahead.
No, well, in some ways, I relate to what Wendy was mentioning when she was talking about the TV show The Crown, and how certain groups of people, they have this made up social structure, this code that they hold each other to. And so I've always felt like an outcast within my group of people, like even within my family. I remember growing up watching a lot of anime and manga, Sailor Moon and what have you, and recreating those characters within like my own makeshift comics at home. And a lot of my family would have an issue with me drawing Asian characters because they didn't look like me. And as I had stated in the very, very first question, with how I relate to the world, a character doesn't need to look like me for me to be able to find value in that personality or character. It's just about who they are and what they do. What they look like comes secondary. So whereas where I come from and within my group of people, that sounds really wild to say, my group of people, but within the Black community, it's always good to put your people first as a priority. But at the same time, as I stated before, it's best to just relate to the world as individuals, relate to people individually. It's kind of difficult for me to speak on, because a lot of my answer and a lot of my experiences deal with isolation. I lived a life of isolation, be it physical or social, so I really don't relate to the world with this type of groupthink, where I just lock arms with people based on check boxes.
Well, about my influences and stuff and this tool I use, right? Well,
yeah, your influences, like how that's influenced, your, even like, I can imagine like if you're gravitate towards a certain kind of art, you kind of gravitate towards like a certain type of brush stroke, which would influence your tool of choice. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm riffing here, but
okay, you got it. Well, since there's not much more things to consume here in Colombia about illustration, I have always looked to the outside. So I love when things look old, like no matter how old, maybe just 50s old, maybe it's pinup, maybe it's just old comics, maybe it's a Lempicka copy of work or something from the avant-garde movement or something. I love when it looks old. So I'm experimenting much in my iPad right now with some new brushes to like get some ink dirts or spots of broken paper, so my drawings look like they're printed in old printers. And I pretty much love that. I love the 80s aesthetic, like everything is pink and glowy and bling bling. I also love Studio Ghibli. It's a huge influence on me. It's been like my companion since I was like 4 years old. And here I have my tiny box again. Oh yeah, the cat bus, yes. I am painting this tiny old oil painting here about Sophie and Hal. And well, I love narratives like that, like take a look at the tiny details, at the things that are small and specific. I also like thought about my obsession with bugs when Wendy was talking. I study biology also, so I love microscopes, I love animals, I love bugs, and I love all the tiny things they have, like the tiny colors and the structures that are like robotic, but they're natural. They're so amazing. I love them. But yeah, my art, well, when it's physical, I love to use brushes, watercolors, oil paintings. They go bad most of the time, but I love to use them. I have made many big ass oil paintings. I'm sorry if I'm not allowed to say that, but yeah, that's mostly it. I just experiment with the things I have around.
Thanks so much. Bashak, how about you? And also, what were you holding up before?
Oh, it's a music box. Where is it?
Oh no, Bashak was holding up something that I couldn't see.
It's Totoro.
Oh, we all love Ghibli.
We all do, yeah. So yeah, actually, I just wanted to talk a little bit about diaspora because I think lately, at least, a lot of the kind of work I do draws on this question of diaspora and what it means to be someone with a sort of supposed origin point that is now like displaced somewhere else. So like in my case, you know, my folks were from India, and I still feel a very strong cultural connection to India, even though I've never lived there. But I always wonder to myself, what does that actually mean? You know, what is it? What is this displaced culture when, especially for me, my parents aren't around anymore. So like, what is it that, other than my skin color, that makes me makes me South Asian, right? And I think this is something that I've been trying to investigate, especially lately, as I say, in my comics work. So, you know, I think it started lately with the graphic novel Apsara Engine. There's one story in there that deals specifically with this question of diaspora, of longing, of nostalgia, and the question of belonging, you know, and it tries to address all of those issues. But I think what inspired me to do it in a way was sort of oblique, because the story is about cartography, right? And how cartography, or like a strategy of like counter mapping, can be a tool to investigate your own culture, or what that culture means. But then, you know, there are practices that I think are like affiliative with cartography. I trained as an architect, so I think that, you know, drawing maps and drawing plans of buildings or investigating things in that visual way, those are two elements that I bring that have influenced me a lot in my aesthetic, and also the way that I represent things on the page. So there's a lot of architectural representation, not just of buildings and backgrounds, but actually architecture as a form of page layout or of like page design or of the way comics can be reinvented if you think of them as architecture in a way. Alongside that, I'm also very influenced by science fiction. And I think that is also, there's an aesthetic to science fiction that I think has familial sort of overlaps with architecture, with a cartography, with design, with industrial design. These are all sorts of things that I'm very much interested in, and it influences a lot of the kind of, people have called some of my work futuristic or kind of zoomy and science fiction-y. And I'm really interested in that aesthetic, but I'm also interested in complicating it. What I think is interesting also is that I think, I'm also very interested in a kind of sensuous, elegant aesthetic. And a lot of that, that's why I use, I use a brush for my work, for finer detail, I do use like these micron pens, but mainly it's the brush that, I keep going back to. And I think that's interesting as a counterpoint to the more kind of hard or architectural line that is in a lot of the work. So, I think it's a really happy kind of coexistence between the sort of sensuousness of the brushwork, and then there's also, the kind of like more cold architectural stuff that happens at the same time. I'm the brushwork comes, I think, from people like that I admired growing up, particularly artists like Aubrey Beardsley is someone that I took a lot of inspiration from, and Edward Gorey, the kind of black and white work that they did. And I was also very influenced by Love and Rockets, like the Jaime Hernandez's work. I found very inspirational, and I took a lot of, character, the aesthetics of character design from all those places. But yeah, I think the question of diaspora has filtered into my work, which not only in terms of content, but in terms of style and aesthetic. And that's something I'm still exploring.
Influences in my own work, right? I kind of take influences from all over. I really love Jamaica Kincaid as a prose writer. And I know this sounds kind of like hoity-toity, but like Jeffrey Eugenides is Middlesex. And in terms of like visuals that I gravitate towards, I really loved Sandman I also loved, but I really loved Shade the Changing Man, Chris Bachalo, Chris Bachalo's early works that are like very, very psychedelic, and kind of take a lot of notes from Alphonse Mucha. So that very like the line work, very detailed line work. But I tend to like surrealism. Like Max Ernst is a huge, like, I really love his work. And I guess I do really like sci-fi and fantasy too, but it's not something, that's not what where my brain goes necessarily. I kind of use surrealist, like fantastical, like elements to sort of like be more allegorical, like than kind of world building, and in terms of like what I'm obsessed with, and I suppose that's why I didn't mean to put so much of my personal leanings into the panel, but I suppose that's where I interpreted this whole thing, this panel, as like Well, it's called Women in Comics. They want to hear about women in comics. Ram has suggested that I ask about like you guys' experiences as women of color in comics. Although I personally know that, you know, as a woman of color, I'm tired of doing women in comics panels. But you know, I still understand their sort of necessity for the rest of the world. And I guess like diaspora is very much a thing that I am obsessed with in some ways, in my work, and the feeling of the feeling of belonging and not belonging and acceptance, whether that is by, you know, your family or your like ancestral family, or it's your romantic partner. These are all things that like family dynamics and kind of like mental health stuff I'm really obsessed with as well.
It's like we have to go through a lot to be who we are and carry our cultures in our backs, but then a white folk can just represent it and be okay with it. Like I suffer a lot from exoticization as a Latin American because I'm not just Colombian, the Colombiana. She's curvy, she's feminine, but I am also like alternative. I am kind of aggressive. I dress in leather, so it's just the exotic Colombian. So I don't think that people, specifically cis white men, see me for who I am, but just because I am this person inside Colombia. I am this girl, specifically this Colombian girl. There's a lot of exoticization and like morbid things around being like Latin American. It's like today I was feeling a bit insecure about wearing yellow because maybe I look too Latin, you know. Maybe it's too Latin because Latinas like yellow.
I get that. Anytime like I feel like, oh, I want to wear like this kind of like Chinese inspired outfit, I'm like, don't do it. You're gonna walk down the street and someone's gonna say, hey, China doll, and no, you're gonna feel uncomfortable. No.
Well, sorry, can I just interject? I think what has really helped me, or just it's just kind of finding the humor in these weird things that like aunties, like especially like, you know, Chinese American aunties of a certain age, like, or in general, as I've spoken to more people through Twitter who are like, oh my God, my mom loves that too. Through like, you know, being connected, it feels very connective when you can rally around a very, very strange niche shared cultural experience. Like I know a lot of Chinese aunties love Filet-O-Fish from McDonald's, and they love The Sound of Music and Princess Diana. Those are three things that, like, I've talked to a lot of Chinese women. I really want to do some kind of weird ethnographic study, but they love this. And I know there are specific things that, you know, Indian aunties also love that I'm told, that Spanish aunties also love. So I just think that it's really funny that that like there's these very specific, like weird things that people of a certain age group and demographic love. But I think it's great. Who doesn't love Princess Diana? Like, I think that's another thing that kind of that I wish more people would look into, like how do, instead of appealing to be accepted by a bigger mainstream audience, to just kind of find the humor in the weird things that we love.
As weird as it sounds, Latino moms are also obsessed with Princess Diana.
Yes, yeah.
They're also obsessed. If you open up my mom's Instagram feed, it's just Princess Diana.
Oh my God. See, like, I think it's because a lot of moms of her generation grew up with this idea, even though it's not true at all. It's just a myth that we were sold, that she was kind of this rags to riches story. But a lot of moms have this fantasy of marry the prince, and she had a hard time getting accepted by the royal family, just like all of this stuff. She had 2 sons, but yeah, they love Princess Diana, and I am
the 2 sons. That's very important.
Like they also, this idea of, like, especially in the Chinese American community I grew up in, they love a caste system. They love this, like, aspiration to wealth. You know, it's a very, and what could be more of a caste system than, like, the British royal family? So,
well, speaking as an Indian auntie myself, I can say that I'm not obsessed with Princess Diana, but I'm sure a lot of Indian aunties are. So I don't know if that's, like, where that comes from. But I also wanted to say, like, you know, I think it might be, as you were saying, Camilla, about, like, kind of being taken aback by cultural appropriation. You know, I think there is a generational component to that. Like, I would say older aunties and uncles, like, for example, if, you know, some celebrity wears, like, a bindi, right, like a white person, you know, I think my cohort, or, you know, people of a certain age and below would be like, whoa, that's just, you know, that ain't right. But the older, like, you know, so I think, like, my aunties and uncles would be like, oh, that's great, they're celebrating our Indian culture. And I'm like, that's just wrong, right? But yeah, like, you know, it's interesting when you're saying, Camilla, about, like, wearing certain things that stand as signifiers. I've been lately, or, you know, in the before times lately, wearing a lot more, like, Indian stuff, like salwar kameezes and stuff, things that mark me as a sort of specific person from a specific place, even though I'm not from there. I don't know. So it's like, but you know what? I feel, like, empowered when I wear stuff like that. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe that's just a way of me trying to ease back into a sense of what I think is belonging. I don't know, but sometimes, you know, it just feels good. It feels like this is who I might have been. So it's almost like trying on another persona or something. Actually, I'm writing a comic right now about this very topic of belonging or not, and of diaspora. And it's called The Tourist. So let's see where that goes.
I can't wait to read it. Well, thank you so much for humoring me about this discussion. I definitely will check out The Crown now. I've been looking for something new to watch, so this is perfect. But yeah, thank you everybody for your time.
Thank you.